Star Wars: The Clone Wars Season 6 for 6 years was the final season of The Clone Wars. Consisting of only 13 episodes, the season was dubbed as The Lost Missions and released only on Netflix. This season is bittersweet for a lot of fans because they were glad they got more Clone Wars, but upset because this should have never been the final season. This is part 6 of a 7-part video series where I go through each season of The Clone Wars and discuss the many aspects of them. From the characters, to the arcs, to the creators, to the production, I'm gonna cover as much as I can. Because even after the series concluded back in 2020, there is still so much to discuss. If you haven't already, I'd highly recommend checking out the previous 5 parts of this video series where I go through the first 5 seasons of The Clone Wars. But if you're all caught up, let's travel back in time to 2013 to look at the peculiar production of The Clone Wars Season 6. Season 5 of Star Wars: The Clone Wars debuted on September 29th, 2012. Just over a month later, on October 30th, 2012, a few days after the premiere of the 5th episode of the season, George Lucas officially sold Lucasfilm and the rights of Star Wars to Disney. Along with the acquisition came the announcement that Lucasfilm would begin working on a sequel trilogy beginning in 2015. Regardless of the acquisition, Season 5 continued to air on Cartoon Network like nothing had changed. However, 10 days after the season finale was released, Lucasfilm put out a press release regarding the future of its animated projects. In the press release, they stated, "After 5 highly successful and critically acclaimed seasons of Star Wars: The Clone Wars, we feel the time has come to wind down the series. The Clone Wars was ending prematurely." In the subsequent years, we learned that Dave Filoni and George Lucas had planned for 8 seasons of the series. Fans were left devastated that 3 of those seasons would never reach their TV screens. To this day, there has never been a concrete reason given for why the show was cancelled, but given the events surrounding the Disney acquisition of Lucasfilm and multiple quotes from people behind the scenes, it's pretty obvious what the major reasons for the show's cancellation were. So let's go through these likely reasons. When George Lucas began The Clone Wars, he had a contract with Cartoon Network that gave them the distribution rights to air The Clone Wars. It's not clear when this contract would have concluded, but that date was well after the Disney purchase. Just because Disney now owned Lucasfilm, that didn't mean they could just void the contract with Cartoon Network. So because of this, Disney didn't want to spend money on a series that would not only not air on one of their platforms, but it would air on a rival network. This is likely the biggest reason why The Clone Wars was cancelled. This is also why almost immediately after the conclusion of The Clone Wars, Lucasfilm had Filoni work on another animated project, one that could air on the Disney platform. Another factor to consider was how dark the series was becoming. I've stated many times throughout the series that The Clone Wars aged with its audience, but even Cartoon Network wasn't thrilled with how dark the series was becoming. Because remember, Cartoon Network was still a network aimed for children. Daniel Logan, the actor of Boba Fett, said this in 2018, "I think it was getting a little too graphic. Boba was doing some really cool stuff. He started actually becoming a bounty hunter. At the time, it was just too graphic, I think, for what Disney was used to." Netflix's VP of Content Acquisition had this to say, "The series really aged up over the years. It went to a darker place and didn't fit the Cartoon Network brand any longer. So it was a hidden gem that Disney brought to our attention, and we jumped all over it." So the series becoming progressively darker was certainly a reason why it was cancelled. And the other major factor that people don't often consider was how expensive producing the show was. George Lucas was able to fund the series from his own pocket. Even though the show was a critical and commercial success, it is likely that The Clone Wars didn't turn as much of a profit as you would think. But because Lucas was a billionaire and he was passionate about the project, he didn't care about the profit margins. He made The Clone Wars simply because he wanted to. Now that Disney owned the franchise, it just wasn't financially viable to continue the series, especially since it would be airing on a different network. So as much as we hate Disney for canceling the series, it would never make sense for them financially to keep it going. They would have absolutely lost money. This is why Star Wars Rebels, the show succeeding The Clone Wars, looked so much worse while being a newer show, because the budget for each episode was significantly less. So, for those reasons, The Clone Wars was cancelled. However, Ahsoka walking off into the abyss would not be the last fans would see of The Clone Wars. Back in those days, television shows were often made years years in advance. So when the show was canceled in 2013 after the conclusion of Season 5, Season 6 was mostly done, Season 7 was actively being produced, and Season 8 was being written. Nowadays, we live in a streaming climate where production of a season can only begin once the previous season has concluded. This is why shows like House of the Dragon or Star Wars shows like Andor need years between seasons of the show. This is a symptom of the modern streaming climate that I absolutely hate, but that's a topic for another day. With the Clone Wars, since a large portion of Season 6 was completed by March of 2013, Filoni and the team were given the green light to put the final touches on some of these episodes. 13 of these Season 6 episodes were allowed to be completed. On February 13th, 2014, it was announced that Netflix would be airing these 13 episodes under the banner The Clone Wars: The Lost Missions, and on March 7th, 2014, these episodes all aired on Netflix. And that is the complicated production of what we now know as The Clone Wars Season 6. How did this shortened season turn out? Well, let's dive deep into The Lost Missions. Season 6, like Season 5, is divided into arcs, some longer than others. We begin the season with the Inhibitor Chip arc, then there's the Banking Clan arc, the Jar Jar and Mace Windu arc, and the season concludes with the Force Ghost arc. Let's start from the beginning. The Inhibitor Chip arc with Fives is another Clone Wars masterclass. Because the first 5 seasons did such an excellent job developing the clones, the writers now have to answer the big question: why were the clones all so willing to kill the Jedi? This is something that has to be answered. You can't show the clones becoming best friends with the Jedi and then have them voluntarily kill the Jedi in Revenge of the Sith. The way they do this is, of course, with the Inhibitor Chip. Now, the Inhibitor Chip choice raises a debate about why the clones killed all the Jedi. In the expanded universe, the clones and the Jedi didn't have as close of a relationship. The clones also knew right from the start what Order 66 was. They were bred to be completely obedient, so when Order 66 happened, they just followed orders. I will forever defend the approach the Clone Wars show took over the expanded universe. For one, I can never understand how developing the clones and making them feel human would be a bad thing. The prequel trilogy is so anti-war that it only makes sense in the Clone Wars to show how much war hurts people, and Filoni and his team do this. Throughout the show, we see the clones suffer over and over again. Umbara was the best example of this. So because of that, I fully support anything that makes Revenge of the Sith more tragic than it already is. So showing the clones for 7 whole seasons as these kind and empathetic people, and then ripping our hearts out because they were forced to betray the people they cared about, is tragic. Seeing clones involuntarily sacrifice themselves to kill one Jedi is tragic. Seeing how close the Jedi were to the clones and having them be betrayed by one simple order is tragic. The moment where Rex cries during the series finale only works if the clones are forced against their will to obey Order 66. For those reasons, I will always defend the Inhibitor Chip decision. Now, looking at the actual execution of this arc, having Fives be our eyes and ears throughout this story was a wise decision. The whole point of this arc is to tell us what really happened with the clones during Order 66. But the Clone Wars is not an encyclopedia. It is a show telling stories. This arc needs to convey this message in a compelling way. How is this done? By having the truth behind the Inhibitor Chip be a mystery, and one of the clones is trying to figure out the truth. We aren't just told in an exposition dump what the Inhibitor Chip was. We are told over the course of 4 episodes as this mystery. We also learn things about the Inhibitor Chip at the same time that Fives does, and that's a good way to get us in the shoes of a character. Now, similarly to the Umbara arc, this arc shows all the ways we love the clones, but it does it through Fives here. Fives is only relevant in this story because Tup was one of his best friends. Human beings have best friends, not mindless robots. Fives is clever. He's able to manipulate AZ in doing what he wants. Human beings are capable of being clever, not mindless robots. Fives is compassionate. He risks his life to save his friend. Human beings are compassionate, not mindless robots. I think you guys get what I'm trying to say. The thought of losing all agency is what drives Fives crazy, and this only works if you show us how human the clones really are. There's a lot of other moments as well that highlight this aspect of the clones, like the moment where a clone going rogue Snoke is questioned, and it is said that the Jedi have inspired creative thinking in the clones. That moment strengthens the bond between the Jedi and the clones, but also, again, humanizes the clones. The little arc that AZ has was also effective. The arc begins with AZ saying, "I'm not capable of human emotions," but as the arc progresses, his concern with Fives grows more and more. Concern and attachment is a human emotion. The clones are so human and so likable that they are even able to change droids a bit. That's good storytelling. This arc also tackles these moral questions surrounding the clones. The Kaminoans are so willing to terminate the life of a clone to get answers about the supposed tumor. This raises questions about inhumane testing. They're essentially treated as lab rats rather than human beings, and it is repeated over and over again in this arc how the clones are not people but property, trying to dehumanize the clones. And then in the last episode we see a clone bar where clones go to have fun. The villains in this show try to dehumanize the clones, and the rest of the show hammers it home how lovable and human the clones are. That's why this arc and most of the clone-focused arcs work. The arc is pretty much about a person learning other people can take away his agency, and he dies trying to tell the truth, but no one believes him. It's tragic, just like the ending of the show, and just like the ending of Revenge of the Sith. This Fives arc is probably a top 5 arc in the entire show. It's at least one of my favorite arcs. Moving on to the Banking Clan arc, this arc is definitely underrated. If this was an arc in season 1, it would have focused entirely on the Banking Clan with zero interest in the characters. So what this arc does well is, of course, have those political elements along with interesting character work. The episode is pretty much the Clovis episode from season 2, but longer and better. Is the exploration of the Banking Clan interesting? Yeah. In this arc, we hear about interest rates, fraud, war profiteers, special interest groups, etc. Arcs like this do make it a little harder to say the Clone Wars is for kids, because what 10-year-old knows what an interest rate is? But regardless, it's pretty cool seeing all these real-world concepts explored in Star Wars. What makes this arc far more interesting to me, however, is the stuff with Anakin. Yeah, he's still insecure about Padme being around a man like Clovis, but the episode explores these questions in a far more interesting way than it did in season 2. We see a bit of that possessive side of Anakin that Lucas has spoken about. He actually channels the dark side when it comes to his jealousy. We see him unleash that anger and how it strains Padme and his relationship. It was so interesting to see Padme saying she needs a break from Anakin and watching Anakin react to that. I'm so glad they finally addressed in this show how hard it would be to keep a marriage like theirs going. Because yeah, being in a relationship like theirs would be a really hard thing to do. Padme questioning this relationship and if it makes her happy or not is a human thing to do, and it makes me appreciate Padme more. The scene between Anakin and Obi-Wan where Obi-Wan talks to him about feelings and emotions was so needed between the two. In Attack of the Clones, Anakin kept on saying he wishes he could dream about Padme, and Obi-Wan never says anything. Finally, the obvious crush he has on Padme is addressed, and I was glad it was addressed between Anakin and Obi-Wan. Kudos to Clovis, by the way. He's the only person in the galaxy who could figure out that Padme and Anakin were together. People may also forget that this arc does have some relevance to the overarching story. The whole reason this plot with the banks exists was to show another facet of Palpatine consolidating power. Are we thinking about how Palpatine got control of the banks in Revenge of the Sith? No, of course not. But since the prequels only have so much time, they could only show Palpatine declaring himself Emperor. The Clone Wars has the opportunity to show the subliminals of how that happened. Last season we saw how big the Republic war machine was, and in this season we see how he gained power over all the banks. Little details like this make Palpatine's ascension to Emperor feel a bit more realistic. People may not remember this arc because it didn't feature the Sith or because it didn't have any major battles, but this arc explored politics, it explored the characters, and it was relevant in the wider scope of the story. An arc that is nothing like this would be the Jar Jar and Mace Windu arc. Each season of the Clone Wars has a few of these episodes that are truly made for kids and aren't any deeper than that. I will say this about this 2-episode arc, however, pairing Jar Jar and Mace Windu is such a brilliant idea. Just something about the goofiest character and the most serious character working together is hilarious. I audibly laughed when Jar Jar said Mace Windu was his servant, and Mace Windu just gives him that Samuel L. Jackson look. That's funny shit. The only other part of this arc that raised my eyebrows was the scene where it was said these people could steal Force essence. Many of you won't want me to bring this up, but it's my duty to do so. The idea that these people can steal someone's Force essence is the closest we have gotten to an explanation for how Palpatine returned. If these weirdos can steal Force essence, then maybe you could convince me that Palpatine learned how to transfer his Force essence. Emphasis on maybe. The season wraps up with this Yoda and the Force arc. As interesting as a lot of what happens here is, I have some serious issues. The concept of Yoda learning how to become a Force ghost is an excellent idea. Tying Qui-Gon to that is also something I'm a fan of. It makes the brief moment between Yoda and Obi-Wan in Revenge of the Sith feel more organic and not something completely out of nowhere. Seeing the Wills is interesting, and all this is cool. Here is where my issues lie. It took 6 seasons for the Clone Wars to do something that made me look upon the prequels more negatively. So in this arc, the Jedi are investigating the death of Sifo Dyas, the Jedi who commissioned the clones way back when. Eventually, Anakin and Obi-Wan learned that Dooku is Tyrannus, aka another guy who is involved with the creation of the clones. Here's what the Jedi know by the end of this season. They know from Attack of the Clones that a Sith Lord is in charge of the Republic. They now know that Count Dooku, the Sith apprentice, was involved with the creation of the clone army. From earlier in the season, they learned there's this inhibitor chip in the clones that can control them, and they also know one of these inhibitor chips malfunctioned, and that malfunction led to a clone killing a Jedi. The Council openly acknowledges all this, and they decide to do nothing. From the prequel films, sure, I don't love them, but I can buy that the Jedi's arrogance led to their downfall. The Clone Wars, however, with Season 6, has made the Jedi a group of idiots. I worked in software once. If we had a bug on our platform that had catastrophic consequences, it would only take one slip up for us to pause everything and fix this bug. Do you guys remember that Peloton story a few years back where a kid died because he got crushed by a treadmill? It took one instance of this happening for Peloton to do a total recall of all their treadmills. The Jedi find out a clone with a defective inhibitor chip killed a Jedi, and they don't do anything about it. The Jedi are morons. You could argue that the Jedi aren't in a position to do anything because without the clones, the Republic is screwed. That's fair, but the Jedi don't raise this as a concern. Yoda says the clones are loyal and we're going to keep the truth about Dooku a secret. Idiots! So this arc has some cool things, but it somehow made my negative view of the Jedi of the prequels even worse. Season 6 definitely has a lot to offer with its shortened season. Even the episodes I don't like the Yoda episodes, most people seem to like. So let's go to the ratings and see what most people have to say. Season 6 has a 100% critical score on Rotten Tomatoes from 12 reviews. It did also get a 95% score from audiences, tying it with Season 4 as the second highest rated season by audiences on Rotten Tomatoes. IMDb doesn't give individual scores for the seasons, but if you were to average the 13 episodes from Season 6, you would get a score of roughly 7.98 out of 10. This is 1/100th of a point shy of Season 5's score. So Season 6 technically breaks the streak of each season being rated higher than the previous one. The highest rated episode of the season according to IMDb was Sacrifice with a 9.2 out of 10, and the lowest rated episode was The Disappeared Part 1 with a 6.5 out of 10. Now this is usually the part where I wrap up the video. I'll say thank you for watching and tune back in a couple days for the next part. But I thought I'd give you guys a little bit of a bonus. Many of you have been asking for it, so for you guys, I'm gonna cover all the unfinished arcs. These arcs are also known as the Clone Wars Legacy arcs. So let's dive deep into the 12 unfinished arcs, shall we? After the conclusion of Season 6, there were speculated to be 52 episodes spanning over 12 arcs that were never made. So let's dive deep into these 12 arcs. We'll discuss briefly what they're about, how much they were completed, and whether or not they were adapted into another medium. Let's begin with the Son of Dathomir arc. If you watched The Clone Wars and only The Clone Wars, you may be confused by Maul's story, because in Season 5, the last time we saw Maul, he was being tortured by Palpatine. Palpatine said he was not going to kill Maul because he had other uses for him. But then the next time we see Maul after that is in Season 7 after he's built a criminal empire. This Son of Dathomir arc would have explained what happened. The basic premise of this arc is that Palpatine would have used Maul as a means to destroy Mother Talzin, because Palpatine saw her as a threat to his coming empire. Maul escapes, however, and makes his way to Dathomir. There's this big conflict between Maul, Dooku, Grievous, Talzin, and the Jedi. Maul forms the Shadow Collective, aka his crime syndicate. Grievous also also kills Mother Talzin during this arc, and the arc ends with Maul escaping once again. There is no footage of any kind available for this arc. Now, the arc was adapted into a comic series named Darth Maul, Son of Dathomir, so the events of this unfinished arc are canon and you can read about it in the comic series. This arc would have been really cool to see. The Maul episodes in this show are pretty great, and I'm sure this arc would have been great too. And it also would have explained how Maul was able to escape from Sidious. The next arc is the Crystal Crisis on Utapau arc. This arc would have involved Anakin and Obi-Wan going to Utapau, the planet we see in Revenge of the Sith. During this arc, Anakin and Obi-Wan learn that the Separatists are mining Kyber crystals. The reason they are mining Kyber, we later learn, is to power the Death Star. Of all the unfinished arcs, this arc was the one that was the closest to being completed. You can actually go on YouTube and watch the 4 episodes in their unfinished forms. All the voice acting is complete, all the music is complete, and the animation is completed enough to where you can actually watch it and know what's going on. The arc isn't super necessary, but I would have liked to have seen it because there are some really nice scenes between Anakin and Obi-Wan. One of the more jarring aspects of the current season 6 is that Anakin never reflects on what happened with Ahsoka. Here we see some of that and Obi-Wan comforts him. This arc is canon, but it was not adapted into any other medium. The next arc was the Bad Batch arc. Of the 12 unfinished arcs, this arc was one of the 3 that were completed in the eventual 7th season on Disney+. It was left in a similar state to the Crystal Crisis on Utapau arc in that it was mostly completed. There are a few changes that were made when revisiting it during season 7, but the basic storyline is pretty much the same. The next arc was probably the biggest arc that was never made, and that is the Dark Disciple arc. This arc would have been 8 episodes that spanned over 2 seasons. The basic premise here is that Asajj Ventress and Quinlan Vos team up to assassinate Count Dooku. There are some reels available to see, but unlike Utapau and the Bad Batch arcs, you can't watch them as uncompleted episodes. These 8 episodes were eventually adapted into a novel titled Dark Disciple. This novel was fantastic, and it's such a shame that we never got to see these final episodes. Now, this arc has become infamous because Ventress was supposed to die in this arc, but they brought her back in the Bad Batch. So we kinda have to question if this arc is still canon or not. The next arc was going to be a bounty hunter arc. This arc would have followed Cad Bane and Boba Fett as they try to rescue a child from Tusken Raiders. This arc was famous for showing how Boba Fett got the dent in his helmet. Similarly to the Dark Disciple arc, you can find some reels of these episodes, but they are not watchable episodes. This arc was not adapted into any other medium. The next arc is the Ahsoka Walkabout arc. Like the Bad Batch, this arc was eventually completed in the 7th season, but the original arc was going to be a bit different. Instead of Ahsoka stumbling upon Trace and Rafa, she would have met up with this guy Nix. Nix was described as a scoundrel and was someone Ahsoka would become very close with. Prior to its completion on Disney+, only a few reels remain of the original episodes. The next arc is Kashyyyk. This arc would have featured Yoda and the Bad Batch going to Kashyyyk to help the Wookiees fight the Trandoshans. In Revenge of the Sith, Yoda says he has a good relationship with the Wookiees. This arc would have shown how he built that relationship. A few reels remain of this arc, but they are not watchable episodes, and the arc was never adapted into any other medium. This arc would have been cool to see, as it would have featured the return of Chewbacca, but I'm not going to lose sleep over not being able to see it. The remaining 5 arcs have no available footage whatsoever, and they have very little details available as well. First was an arc described as the Rex and R2 Top Gun arc. Filoni described this arc as Top Gun with clones. Clone pilots would have feuded with normal army clones, and eventually Rex would pair up with R2 and fly a starfighter. I love the clone episodes, so this would have been cool to see. The arc was never adapted into another medium. The next arc is the Yuzhong Vong arc. Pablo Hidalgo, the head of the Lucasfilm Story Group, had this to say about the arc. The storyline really played on the alien abduction vibe. It was almost like an X-Files episode of Star Wars: The Clone Wars. The Vong were a big part of the old expanded universe, and this arc would have shown them scouting out the main Star Wars galaxy. This arc was never adapted into another medium and is absolutely not canon. The third to last arc was the Return to the Jedi Temple arc. In the arc, Ahsoka would have warned the Jedi of a secret Sith shrine in the Jedi Temple. She would have teamed up with Anakin and Obi-Wan to find the shrine and rescue a captured Master Yoda. I would have loved to have seen this, but because we now know the Siege of Mandalore was the first time Anakin and Ahsoka had seen each other since the Wrong Jedi arc, this arc no longer has a place in the canon. The arc was not adapted into any other medium. The penultimate arc was the Return to Mon Cala arc. This arc would have featured Padme seeking support from the Mon Calamari and the Quarren to gain support to remove Palpatine from office. This arc would have addressed Palpatine's prolonged tenure as Supreme Chancellor, something that's brought up in Revenge of the Sith. These Padme episodes were often really good, so I absolutely would have liked to to have seen it. Like so many others, this arc was not adapted into any other medium. The final arc of the Clone Wars was the Siege of Mandalore arc. As we know, this arc was adapted into the 7th season of the Clone Wars. Previously, there was no adaptation of this arc, but it was referenced a handful of times during Star Wars Rebels, which came out before the 7th season of the Clone Wars. So of the 12 unfinished arcs, 3 were completed in the 7th season, 2 were adapted into other mediums, 1 can be watched in its incomplete form, and 6 will forever remain in the abyss. Tune back in a couple days to see my breakdown of the final season, aka Season 7. Until then, thank you everybody so much for watching another one of my videos. Don't forget to tonight the Clot Squad, and I will see you guys next time.